Hello and welcome back to TVP World. My name is Alex Simlinsky and these are World Talks. Russia's central bank has raised interest rates to 19%, their highest level since the invasion of Ukraine. The country is facing soaring inflation driven by the Kremlin's massive military spending. And joining us to talk about this further is Sergey Vakulenko, senior fellow from the Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Good evening, glad to see you.
So now the Russian central bank has raised its key rate to 19%, just below the level from late February 2022. Then the policy rate reached an unprecedented 20% in a desperate bid by the bank to try and shore up the ruble and ward off financial collapse amid sanctions that were placed on Russia. What does the situation look like now, and what is the real reason for this move by Russia's central bank?
In Russia, there is an interesting situation. On one hand, you have a quixotic central bank, which tries to run the monetary policy just as a central bank or a monetary authority would do in the US, in Britain, in Europe, and fulfill its mandate, keep inflation low. On the other hand, you have the government and Ministry of Finance, which conduct rather profligate economic policy. And, well, they have a drive to win the war, to make a military-industrial production, to get mercenaries join the army and having their population in cities across Moscow not to feel any military hardship. So the government spends. And Russian ability to import is already limited. So on one hand, you have a limited supply, a diminished supply of goods to the domestic economy. A large part of Russian economy is currently devoted to producing military goods. Imports are lower because Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world. At the same time, the government is spending like there is no tomorrow. You have more money, less good. That's a textbook recipe for inflation. On the other hand, you have a central bank which, contra omnes, tries to find this face wind and tries to act diligently. So this struggle keeps going on, and hence the central bank does pretty much the only thing there is in its disposal, and that's the interest rate, and they keep raising it. However, the central bank is conducting its monetary policy with one arm tied to its body. It's, if you wish, a one-armed boxer. Because for many parts of Russian economy, central bank rates are absolutely meaningless because, for example, the government prepays military expenditures. So for certain parts of the economy, whatever the central bank rate is, their actual cost of capital is zero or sometimes even negative. So the central bank is in an enviable position, having to adjust it even higher for the other half of the economy for which it has some sort of control.
Mm-hmm. So now all this, it does sound very dire and complicated, but now what is the situation of ordinary Russian citizens among all this when it comes to their wages and for paying for things like food and groceries?
I wouldn't call the situation dire. Russia still enjoys a very substantial amount of foreign revenues, probably lower than, say, in 2013 or in 2007 at the peaks of the oil prices, but definitely much higher than, for example, at the better times of Soviet Union. So it's still a middle-income country, even bordering a rich country. Russia still can import quite a lot of goods from China. And then it really depends. If you happen to work in military-industrial complex, life is quite good. Salaries are high. If one of your relatives joined, for example, some construction crew that builds Mariupol or any other town that was damaged by or destroyed by Russian troops and now being rebuilt by Russia as a showcase, Well, your relative probably earns very good salary in occupied Ukraine, and you're doing well. If your relative is a mercenary in the army, you're doing quite well as well. Or if he was killed, the compensation for that relatives is quite high. And if you manage to get that compensation, sometimes it's not easy. However, if you are in other parts of the economy, didn't enjoy that hot water, that high water by military related spending, you would see your savings being eaten by inflation. If you're a pensioner, the pensions are definitely not keeping up with the inflation, and salaries in the rest of the economy were nudging up because employers are desperate as well. Russia is enjoying uh, or experiencing a severe shortage of labor, but definitely they wouldn't be able to keep up with the military. So your salary probably didn't keep up with inflation either. So there is a very substantial redistribution of wealth and income in Russia over the last 3 years, which has accelerated in the last few months.
So now going back to what you said, because you also mentioned sanctions, I wanted to ask, so exactly what kind of impact have Western sanctions had on Russia's economy, and how is Russia continuing to use its oil to make money despite sanctions that have been put on it?
Russia mostly has managed to rearrange its trading flows around the sanctions. There is a recent study by an independent scholar, Alexander Kalendra, who also works for Council for Foreign Relations in Europe, which shows that, for example, EU trade with Russia is effectively pretty much similar to what it used to be before the war. What had happened that direct exports from EU to Russia has dwindled to almost nothing, but they've grown commensurately. The trade between EU and Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkey, and it's quite obvious that those goods flow back to Russia at a markup, of course. So that export is more expensive for Russia than it used to be before, but physically it's going there. Russia is getting many things that it used to import from other countries, from China, probably of lower quality, probably at some markup, but it gets those goods. And when it comes to oil, also Russia oil at the moment is selling steadily above the price cap, and it's not hindered in terms of the volumes, except for only one thing, the OPEC plus limitations. Oil price has been sliding down in the last months. OPEC is trying to curb the slide and demands that its members cut the oil production. Russia has agreed to that. Russia has been reducing its oil production, but less than it's promised, so it has to make good. The overproduction has to reduce oil production even further. But with the recent reductions in the oil price, the effective oil price that Russia sees at the moment is probably below $60 a barrel, below the price cap level. Not because price cap is successful, but because the markets work that way. And interesting enough, if you look at the inflation numbers, $80, $60 today are something like $45 if you rebase it to 2014, 2015. So that's probably starts to hurt. But we will see the effects of that. The slide in the oil price, the need to sell less than before, only in the coming months, not yet.
So now you mentioned sliding oil prices, and then also hundreds of major companies have stopped selling and making goods in Russia. And what about if we add inflation to this? What kind of long-term effects are we looking at?
Um, it was really a mixed bag about companies leaving Russia or staying in Russia under different disguises. Many companies have declared that they were leaving, they didn't leave in true effect. There were situations like IKEA, for example, which has left, but the local manufacturers switched to selling the goods they were selling through IKEA stores to somewhere else, and there are many examples like this. I would say that in the last 2.5 years, Russian economy did readjust itself and is showing itself being rather resilient to the new conditions of trade. Yes, there are difficulties with getting spare parts. There are difficulties with needs to replace Western software, particularly specialized software, things like the control software for industrial installations, which is quite unique. You wouldn't find domestic or Chinese analog for that. It would have to be re-engineered or something like that. But the economy has readjusted. What had happened, though, is that larger parts of Russian economy are being reoriented towards manufacturing of military goods. uh, More of Russian workforce is employed there, and Russia has been facing demographic trough already, even before the war started. So Russian demographic problems are being exacerbated as we speak. So probably Russia might go not necessarily in decline as shown by economic statistics, which is a combination of military production, inflated price, and so on, but in sort of real term decline. Yes, it would happen. So, but it's going to be a slow and sliding decline rather than a sudden crash. So I wouldn't see that Russia would experience anything near to what Soviet Union has experienced in 89 or 90 and so on. But definitely the prospects are bleak. Russian government is currently spending, like there is no tomorrow, all the funds that have been saved before the war. Russia used to save much of its oil expenditure into the Future Generations Fund. It doesn't do so anymore. It spends. And this creates long lasting structural problems for the country in the future, 5 or 10 years from now, but not in the coming year or two.
So now you mentioned Russia's ability to, its economy, the ability to readjust to this new reality that it's facing. And I wanted to ask, so what should the West still do, or maybe do more of, in order to limit the possibilities of Russia making money, which then it can use to fuel its war machine?
It's $1 million question, and I'm not sure anybody has an answer today. The West has tried to limit Russian oil income, facing the reality that it's just impossible to embargo Russian oil altogether. On one hand, West had to tolerate Russian oil in the global markets. On the other hand, trying to limit the revenue. It might work if India and China would cooperate. They didn't. Russia is a rather big economic player and has a very strong partners who are not particularly willing to join the West in Russian-Ukrainian struggle on the side of Ukraine. And with these elements, Russia having substantial amounts of commodity that's needed by the world, that the world cannot give up, oil. It has willing trading partners, India, China, to less extent Turkey. Quite a lot of people who are willing to run the risks for remuneration to facilitate Russian trade. It's really difficult. And certain things that the West held as a given, for example, that US dollar is the global currency and nothing can work outside US dollar, has led, for example, to the internationalization of yuan. Much of Russian trade with the rest of the world is currently conducted in yuans, not only with China. So yuan is becoming another world trade currency, which is probably an unforeseen consequence. So it is difficult.
All right, Mr. Sergey Vakulenko, Senior Fellow, Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center, thank you very much for sharing your insight here with us here on TVP World.
Thank you very much. Good evening.
And that's a wrap for this edition of World Talks, but do stay tuned to TVP World for more news and commentary.